dire straits in the pandemic. So it is good for us to review this, look at this, and share across the globe. We are very happy. We've got a very esteemed panel with us, people who have been working on this issue for the longest time, and who have made recommendations in the past. The focus of this webinar is to be able to look at employer-tied employment visas in that and the challenges that we have had, continue to have, and the recommendations that we have made and continue to make, and more especially to look at how coming out of this, as we talk of in the words of the Secretary General, to build back better. How can we come back building back better with a new kind of model? Is there a new model that we need to push? What is it, and how does this model not become a model of the past and no longer something that we can build firm foundations on for a better future or in a better labor migration governance program? We have as our moderator today, Rola Hatmi from the Cross Regional Center for Migrants and Refugees, and we have a panel that I will ask her to introduce as well. I'd like to thank again CCRM and GFRTD for this jointly co-organizing this, and this will be the last in this kind of collaboration with us on webinars. And Rola will share about this new phase that we will be going into from next week. But I'll let Rola to share more information about that in the course of the webinar. Thank you all for coming and joining us today, and thank you all for also the past webinars and for the feedback that you have been able to give us, the comments, and how it has helped you and your work. And we look forward to continuing this collaboration with you despite the times we are in, and we pray for times that will be better and in better times as well to continue with this collaboration. So thank you very much, and looking forward to what will be discussed today. Over to you, Rola.
Thank you, William, for this initial introduction and framing. My name is Rula Hamati, and I'm very happy to be moderating today's webinar. Today's webinar, the topic of it is really, it's about employer-tied visas. And this is something that's not a new issue. It's been a model for the recruitment and employment of migrant workers for a very long time, but it's still an issue that is very pertinent for us today. Globally, the estimates are about, on migrants, is that we have around 272 million migrants worldwide. 2/3 of them, around 167 million, are migrant workers. Many of these migrant workers actually fall under systems that are employer-tied visas. So this really gives us an idea about the scale of the issue, the importance of the issue. When we talk about employer-tied visas, we are talking about many things. We are talking specifically about workers who are linked to their employers. We are talking about workers who come into countries of destination specifically because of this employment relationship, and they are linked to their employers for the duration of their stay and work in the country of destination. We know from experience that this is not only affecting workers in a general sense of them not being able to pursue other employment opportunities, but it is also affecting workers' rights, because it is having a deep impact on the rights of workers to seek justice, on the rights of workers to mobility, on the rights of workers to report violations, and all of this. On the ground, as NGOs working on the ground, we often see a lot of human rights violations. And maybe just to give an idea for those who may not be necessarily working on the issue of employer-tied visas or employment in that particular context, what we see is often, because workers are linked to their particular employers and need the employer's consent, for instance, to change employment, or even sometimes to exit the country or to quit. What we see is, sometimes employers blackmail workers to allow for this transition. Sometimes employers blackmail workers again to maintain their status in the country. We see people who stay in abusive employment situations precisely because there are no alternatives, and that they know that their employers will abuse the power that they have under the system. William mentioned this in the introduction. When we talk about employer-tied visas, I think intuitively the first example or the first idea that comes to mind is, the notorious kafala or sponsorship system, which is very much alive and kicking in the Arab region. But we know from experience that these models exist in different contexts of the world as well. It's not just in the Arab region. Maybe the most severe manifestation of these regimes are in the Arab region, but we know to some extent they are still alive elsewhere. So our idea today is also to discuss with a comparative lens to see what kind of progress has happened, if any, what kind of issues are arising, and then to see if we can maybe learn in terms of strategies moving forward. In terms of labor standards, and we know very much that this is a labor issue, there are no particular instruments, and we know this, there are no particular instruments that talk to the issue of employer-tied visas. There are obviously a lot of relevant ILO conventions. We can cite here the Convention on Determination of Employment, for instance, or the Forced Labor Convention. But speaking particularly on the issue of employer-tied visas, so far we don't have any instruments that tackle this in terms of labor standards. We also have, comments by the ILO Committee of Experts on this. So, I mean, there is some progress that has been happening globally on this. Again, for those who were very much involved in the Global Compacts negotiations might remember that this, again, was a very contentious and heated issue for member states who were discussing the Global Compact on migration. There were earlier stronger language, for instance, on the whole issue of breaking down the dependency between the worker and the employer, but that was later abandoned in subsequent revisions of the Global Compact. And now we have Objective 6, paragraph 22G, which talks about developing and strengthening labor migration and ethical recruitment processes that allow migrants to change employers and modify the length of their stay with minimal administrative burden. So this is just to point that at the global level, there has been some ways that this has been touched upon. How much it is trickling down in practice, or what are the gaps in practice, is something that we would want to tackle in particular during this webinar. For this particular webinar, we have a highly knowledgeable and highly experienced panel that I will just try to introduce very briefly, just to highlight some of the things that they have done, because obviously these are very, very good experts that we have with us today. Our first speaker, actually, and then I'll start with our first speaker, is Philippe Gonzalez Morales, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. He is also a former president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where he was also commissioner and rapporteur on migrants and refugees between 2008 and 2015. He's also a professor of international law at the University Diego Portales in Santiago, Chile. Our second speaker is Ratna Begum, who is the senior women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch. Ratna has previously worked at Amnesty International, among other things, and she worked on researching human rights issues in the Arab region. Our next speaker, and I don't know if Joel has managed to join us, I think there was some issue there, but our next speaker is Joel Odigy, who is an activist and trade unionist and has been so for the past 2 decades. Joel is the Deputy General Secretary of the African Regional Organization of the International Trade Union Federation, ITUC Africa. And very pertinently, he recently worked on a study about African labor migration to the GCC states. Our fourth speaker is actually Elizabeth Tang. Elizabeth is actually the first elected General Secretary of the International Domestic Workers Federation, IDWF, which was formed in 2013. Before that, Elizabeth also worked very closely on campaigning for the adoption of C189, the Domestic Workers Convention. Our last speaker is Elena Olea, who is the Associate Director of Programs at Alianza Americas. Elena is also an international human rights lawyer who has worked on advocacy and litigation before a number of bodies, including intergovernmental bodies and governmental agencies. Elena also teaches human rights, migration, and gender. So welcome to our all panelists. We're very excited to start the discussion. In terms of the actual mechanics of the webinar, or how we will proceed to do this, each speaker will have about 8 to 10 minutes. We will have a very strict moderation, so meaning we will try to stick to the time limit as much as possible and to render this a conversation because of the nature of the topic. If time allows, I'll be coming back and trying to pick up on some of the questions in chat to come back to our speakers with particular questions so that we can have a more lively discussion. We would also have the opportunity for to call on a few people who are also participating in the webinar. Again, if we stick as much as possible with a time frame and time boundaries that we set ourselves to do that. May I say that the only exception to this rule is actually the special rapporteur, who is only been able to be with us for a short period of time because of something has come up. So we will start with a special rapporteur and we'll go for about 12 minutes because we will not have the chance to come back to you, special rapporteur. So if I can start with you and I mean, just to ask you this question as a start of the conversation. I think in this region, in our region, we, you know, as activists, we often say that the biggest rights violation for migrant workers is in this particular region is the linkage between employer and employee. And if this is sorted out, then the rest of the problems will kind of resolve themselves. As special rapporteur, do you agree with this particular assessment? And how have you seen that the employer-tied visas have affected the enjoyment of human and labor rights of migrant workers, with examples from around the world, not necessarily just from one region? And what could be, you know, as a start of our thinking and the start of our conversation, what could be some of these alternatives that we consider going forward? To you, Philippe.
Thank you very much, Hula, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this webinar. The issue of the employer-tied visas is one that my mandate as special rapporteur has repeatedly addressed in thematic reports and also in visits and in country reports. And this is particularly true regarding the issue of the kafala system that my mandate and our UN human rights bodies that I'm also going to mention have repeatedly stated that is against the international human rights law. There is a strong impact on the human rights of migrants of the employer-tied visas, as this affects labor rights of migrants and also other type of violations that may include gender violence, affectation of the physical integrity of the migrants, the social and economic rights of the migrants, and many other rights. I would like to focus in my presentation particularly on the issue of the kafala system, which, as the moderator was presenting, and I agree, is the most severe type of employer-tied visa system. And I am going to give first a brief explanation about the kafala system for those in the public who may not be familiar enough with it. The kafala system makes migrant workers entirely dependent on their employers, not only as a matter of fact, but also in juridical terms. There is a delegation of powers by the state to the employer regarding the migratory situation of the migrant worker. It is the employer, the one who has the link with the state, not the employee, not the migrant worker. If the contract is severe, the migrant, usually in most situations in the kafala system, cannot move to another job. There are often limitations to the freedom of movement of the migrant workers that might not be entirely free to leave the country of destination due to domestic legal considerations or due to the fact that the employer might have kept the passport of the migrant. As a result, the migratory status of the migrant worker depends on his or her employer. Often, as I was saying, the employers keep the passport of the migrant, and this produces further obstacles for the exercise of the rights of these persons. Often also under the kafala system, migrant workers are excluded from labor law regulations. This might not be the case in each of the countries that apply the system, but it's the case in most of them. The kafala system by itself is exploitative. Migrants can barely complain of violations to the contract or to other abuses. In this regard, there is a clear violation of the right to access to justice. This is a matter that I addressed in a thematic report presented to a General Assembly a couple of years ago, the issue of access to justice, and references also to employer-type visas. This may include the lack of access to legal aid. Sometimes the consulates can provide that, but of course this is a foremost duty for the country of destination to provide the legal aid, despite the fact that of course a strong legal assistance system should be in place. In addition, on many occasions the employers do not attend the judicial hearings and are not actually compelled in many cases to do so. This leads to lengthy procedures and also may have an impact on the access to the enjoyment of our rights, because if you are not able to adequately complain about the violations you are victim of, this may affect your economic and social rights and all your human rights in the end. In the case of the migrants in the domestic service, these features that I just described are more acute and grave. And this is mostly a role that women migrants play. It is estimated that around 5/6 of migrant workers in the domestic service are women. Again, this is an issue that I addressed in another thematic reports, two thematic reports on gender and migration presented last year to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly about the situation of women migrants in the domestic service and how their human rights are affected, also in systems like the kafala. The persons in the domestic service, the migrant and the domestic service are systematically excluded from labor laws, also in countries which have reformed or partially abolished the kafala system. In some countries, now the labor law is applied to migrants, migrant workers, but not to those who are in the domestic service. In addition, in the case of migrants in the domestic service, access to justice and to social and economic rights becomes much more difficult, sometimes virtually impossible, because of the circumstances that there is the link with the employer, there is barely monitoring on the part of the state or of the consulates and so forth. All the types of exploitation and abuses that I have described are more frequent and grave in the case of migrants in the domestic services. I would like to make some additional points about the kafala system. The kafala system is based on the assumption that the migratory situation of the migrant is a temporary one. So it is not envisioned to promote integration of the migrant into the country of destination, into the society, let alone to establish a road for the migrant worker to become at some point a citizen of the country of destination. So it is really connected to the idea that the migratory situation, the migratory status is a temporary one, very much temporary as it depends on a single employer. In this regard, there is a need for recognition of the rights of migrant workers to belong to trade unions. This is a key aspect. If the migrant workers are not allowed to belong to trade unions, the possibility of defending their rights becomes virtually a fantasy. This is an issue that I have addressed in a thematic report that I just presented to the Human Rights Council, the issue of freedom of association of migrants, and also freedom of association of their defenders. And this includes, in a key situation, the right to associate to trade unions or to form trade unions or associations more generally. There is also a need to recognize the right of trade unions and of the civil society to monitor the conditions of the migrant workers, especially under the kafala system. In all systems, of course, this is needed, and this is a right for the associations and the trade unions to monitor the situation of migrant workers. But this need becomes more acute in the case of the kafala system. Finally, I would like to recall that many human rights bodies at the United Nations have condemned the kafala system and stated that it is a form of contemporary slavery. Among them are my mandate, the Special Rapporteur on the Contemporary Forms of Slavery, the Committee on Racial Discrimination, the Committee Against Discrimination Against Women, the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, and many other United Nations human rights bodies. There have been many mentions in thematic and country reports, and also repeated communications on specific cases of grave abuses that my mandate have addressed to state, including this year. So it's a situation that is ongoing, and it's indispensable to address. So that's why I have focused on this matter. In the end, the subsistence of the kafala system is an issue of major concern for international human rights organizations, and we will keep denouncing it until it's wholly dismantled by the states that continue to have this system. So I very much appreciate this opportunity to address the public on this issue, and you can be sure that my mandate will continue to monitor the situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur, for highlighting, the body of how much people have been, saying and denouncing some of the practices and denouncing, sponsorship regimes and, highlighting the problems within the system. And I think it's very interesting the way that you have traced this back to the whole conception of migration as being a temporarily arrangement where workers come into a country and then are supposed to write back. I think this is very important to also think about, ways we can also keep thinking about these issues. And I think the pandemic, in a way, has really, maybe has also done some changes in us in terms of thinking about migration, whereby people were coming in, there was a non-interrupted supply, if we can say, of people who can come into countries and work. And all of a sudden, this whole thing stopped. And then countries of destination are in situations where they have to look, do we need to talk more in terms of mobility? Do we need to talk more in terms of looking at these arrangements where workers can move freely within the country of destination? If I can just have a quick follow-up with you, do you think as the post-pandemic world, we will see more of these? I know, for instance, Singapore has been exploring these ideas of allowing workers to transition within the country of destination as a result of the COVID-19 situation. Do you think we'll see more movement along those lines? And what can the UN system as a whole do to keep the pressure on and also keep the advocacy going?
Thank you, Julia. And I'm sorry that I will have to leave as a moderator announced it before. Well, I think that throughout the pandemic, it has become clear that many of the features about the situation and the policies on migrants around the world have become much more acute. And depending on the policies in place at the time of the pandemic began, to a large extent has been the result during the pandemic. So those countries which already had restrictive policies for the human rights of migrants now have a very extreme situation of violations of human rights. I would say it's very difficult to foresee how the future after the pandemic is going to be, including on the issue of migrant workers around the world. Of course, the United Nations human rights mechanisms, we are going to continue paying close attention to this situation, and among them, the impact that the employer-type visas have on migrants. But it's definitely very difficult to make to foresee the future in the current context. Thank you, Rula.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur, for being with us. And I know you have to leave us, which is unfortunate, but we also hope to have you in future webinars. Thanks so much for being with us. Rafna, if I can go to you, I know as in your role in Human Rights Watch, you've worked very closely on looking at these employer-type visa regimes and looking at the rights violations that happen on the ground and highlighting those. But we also know that things are sometimes in flux, and there has been a number of, let's say, changes in a number of countries where they are kind of looking at experimenting with different models, with more, let's say, sometimes even flexible models of employment. And then we often talk about two different things when we talk about employer type. We talk about this as a system of admissions, and then we talk about this as a system of employment or as a system of stay. And most of these reforms or changes have been as a system of employment, meaning once the worker is in the country of origin. If you can take a step back with you, Ratna, just to think from your work, why do you think we still have these systems where there could be different alternatives? And then have you seen any practical difficulties in moving away from these systems? Have you seen examples, for instance, where alternatives were successful and were considered? And what can we do on the ground to accelerate the change?
Great. So thank you so much for this webinar. I think it's a really important discussion to have. I want to take us back a little bit in terms of the context in which kafala has existed as a concept. As many of you know, kafala is a long-standing concept in the Arab world, which is not really a harmful thing at all. In fact, it was a very positive thing. It's an idea of somebody being a legal guarantor, somebody who takes on the legal responsibility for somebody who cannot perform those responsibilities, like, for instance, when they incur a debt that can be paid for, or other issues like that. So that itself existed for a long time. But actually in the Gulf, what we saw happen was under the UK, the British protections, did we see that through colonialism, essentially, that kafala as a sponsorship system, as we now know it, became bureaucratized and instrumentalized. And it was essentially a way of the British being able to have control over their foreign worker population, which is the Indian subjects, which they brought into these countries to work in these sectors. And with the oil boom that happened, it allowed them to bring more migrant labor and more ways of controlling this migrant labor. So really, when you look at the Gulf region, it has, as part of its own history and its independence, has been completely embroiled in the idea of kafala, being completely endemic to its status, to the way it's built up its cities and the way it's actually developed. Migrant labor has, and the kafala sponsorship system, even with the British leaving, has really been part of their history. In addition, it's incredibly, they've enriched by this migrant labor, but not just because of migrant labor, but the kafala system allowing them to have very cheap exploitative labor has meant that they've been incredibly enriched. And what we're seeing now is a system that is incredibly difficult to dismantle because it's $1 billion industry. You have recruiters who are making sheer amounts of money off workers who are paying fees to come into the country. even if there's no job at the end of the day. So there are people, whether it's the agent, whether it's an employer who is getting a kickback, they are making a lot of money of workers just being brought into the country and having what they've been calling a guest worker system. So instead of having a number of workers come, stay for a long time and do the work, they were more invested in having workers come and go every 2 or 3 years, because it allows for them to continue to make money in this way, to overwork workers and get a new batch of new workers at the same time. So this is an ongoing system that has been, it's incredibly exploitative, but it's incredibly enriching for so many of the citizens and others in this country. And it's incredibly difficult to dismantle as a result. Now, I also want to reflect that this obviously, in terms of employer-tied visas, this is not the first region to have them. And we have documented the same levels of human rights abuses and exploitation in other countries where this has happened. So for instance, in the US, we documented how agricultural workers under the H2 tied visa system of temporary agricultural workers were then subject to labor rights abuses because they were not able to change employers. In the same way, we also documented how in the UK, they had actually had a model of a tied visa system for people wanting to bring their domestic worker into the UK. And they removed that in the 2000s and then reintroduced it in 2012. The Tory government then sort of reintroduced in 2012. There's some implications as to who prompted them to actually reintroduce it, because the largest number of workers that were being brought here were from the Gulf as well, or by their Gulf employers. And we documented, again, abuses of migrant domestic workers, very similar to what they experienced in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but experiencing in the richest, one of the richest cities in the world, like London, in the corners of West London, also finding their passport confiscated, being beaten and subject to very long working hours. So whether they were in Dubai and London, it became the same thing, because the issue was the same. They were on a tied visa system where they couldn't change employers. So this, the idea of whether you're able to leave your employer freely and change your employer is absolutely crucial, because that is where we see exploitation taking place. Now, in terms of looking at other models, we have, I think because of the sheer amount of pressure, the uncovering of the abuses and exploitation has led to a number of states considering tinkering with the model, and not just because of abuses, but because this model also ends up with lots of problems for the labor market. It has led to less Gulf nationals being able to attain jobs at higher levels in the private sector. So there's been also lots of grumblings that has allowed Gulf states to start to think about different models and nationalization policies in order to try to deal with the other types of effects that are happening in the country as well. And so what we've seen really is Bahrain has explored the flexi visa model, in which workers themselves who are in the country, who are documented, can pay to change to this visa, where they can then work for a number of different employers. This is essentially legalizing an already existing practice known as the free visa system, in which workers were paying a sponsor a certain amount of money in order to be able to work for any other employer. This just meant that the government was taking the money instead of these black market employers or sponsors. We've also seen a number of countries start to tinker a little bit, where if, like in Saudi Arabia, if you were a company that wasn't paying your workers, or you started to commit a number of labor rights violations, potentially they could move you into a different category and you wouldn't be allowed to introduce work permits, or workers would be allowed to change employers. And the UAE has been considering other models, and they've been looking at how to potentially close the internal labor market. So there's less workers coming in, but the workers existing there would be able to change employers. They haven't actually taken any steps, but they are considering it. And Qatar is the major one that we've been really hoping for that will actually come through on this, on the reforms, because they have actually committed to doing so with the International Labour Organization. And what they're looking at is essentially allowing workers to be able to change employers, but only after a certain amount of time. Now, one of the key challenges we're facing is actually around recruitment fees. So the argument that normally happens is that employers have paid a certain amount of money, often about $2,000, or $1,000 to $2,000, in which if a worker is able to come to the country, they can just leave them and go work for another employer. What happens to that money? Now, we explored this in a working group that the labor minister in Lebanon, for instance, set up, and we discussed what could happen in those instances. And we worked out potentially, yes, because you have individual employees for domestic workers, it is a different cost issue because usually they may not be able to constantly pay up this much money. But at the same time, a worker needs to be able to be granted the right to be able to leave or change employers. So there was a way of potentially having a mechanism in which the worker doesn't pay, but a new employer could pay back some part of the money, depending on how long they're there for. And that could also be a cutoff date so that it's not consistent. It doesn't have to be longer than 6 months and so on. So there was a lot of different ways that we can consider that. The other issue that we do need to contemplate is if you are able to change employers easily, or the kind of visa model that you exist on. Say we switch, instead of employer-based visa model, you have a worker that comes in on a domestic worker visa. You don't have a specific employer, but you're on a domestic worker visa. What happens then to your healthcare insurance? Who is supposed to be responsible for accommodation? Will you end up with more homeless migrant workers essentially in the end? And so there has to be other kinds of protections put in place so that somebody in the country is able to exercise those rights, those ability to be housed, to be able to access healthcare, to do so even if they don't have a specific employer they are tied to, who may not be the one actually paying for this. So there could be ways, there are lots of models actually out there that in which the employers can pay into a scheme. That means that a domestic worker could access that if they want to take sick leave, for instance. That can be considered. But those are the kinds of challenges that need to really be thought through as you start moving into a new model of what does it look like to bring a migrant worker into the country. Are they going to be still tied essentially as an employer who at least sponsors them initially, but then they're allowed to leave? Or are we looking for a visa model in which workers can come into a country on a visa without a specific employer being tied to them? And I think there is lots of ways in which we can still pursue that. In terms of the last question that you posed, what can be done to accelerate change? I still think it's about bringing through those human stories. This is whatever happens, even if we can talk about the colonial histories, the terrible labor market problems, the ways in which this doesn't actually always work for the state or for the employer, it is fundamentally morally repugnant that we have a system that allows for the types of abuses and exploitation to occur. And I do see this similar to a situation like the slave trade. While kafala is in no way slavery because people are able to come and are able to work, slave trade was in a very similar way a form of exploitation that was incredibly, it created a huge amount of wealth for people from all the way from widows to people who were actually committing terrible forms of torture to people who never even saw the migrant worker, the slave who was working on a plantation, for instance. But people did not want that situation to be changed because of the fact that they were making so much money out of it. And in the same way, the kafala system has a very similar problem. So we do need to think about how do we make the case for the change from kafala as being so morally repugnant that it means that you simply cannot have it exist in the way it doesn't matter how much it enriches people. So that's where I'd like to leave it. And I'm happy to explore more ways in which we can contest that argument. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ratna. And I think you kind of make a very strong case to say how many vested interests are in systems. A long time it's the employers, it's the recruitment agencies. It's sometimes the state does not want to take its duty in terms of providing childcare, in terms of providing elderly care, or all sorts of services that the state is also supposed to provide. And I think you raise some very interesting questions that we need to explore as the webinar progresses in terms of these are kind of the alternatives that are being proposed, but these are some of the challenges. You talk about healthcare, but you've also talked about recruitment fees, and also noteworthy to note that in some countries in the region, Jordan as an example, at some point there was an experimentation to say, let's do an insurance on recruitment fees and things like that. So these are all kind of things to come back to as we progress in the discussion. But thank you very much for that. I think Joel has managed to join us, but before I ask you the question, Joel, are you there? Did you manage to have a functioning connection?
Yeah, thanks. I'm here.
Perfect. Very good. Thank you for joining us, Joel. We're very happy that you are here today.
Thank you.
Just picking up from what Rathna was saying about some of the problems within the structures of the kafala system, within the structure of sponsorship or employment employer-type visas. In the context of African migration, we know in the Arab region that, for instance, the African migration is a new kind of migration, and because it is new, sometimes we see that there are also more gaps as well in terms of workers' protection. My question to you, Joel, what are some of the specific issues that we see as a result of having these kinds of systems for African migrant workers into this region, but also maybe beyond that, where such models exist?
Okay, thanks, and good afternoon from this side of our world. And the name is Akato Joel Odigy. I'm the Deputy General Secretary, African Regional Organization of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC Africa. We are based in Lomé, Togo, but at the moment I'm in Abuja, Nigeria, because we are all working from home since March this year, COVID-19 realities. And having this kind of meeting represents what some of us think is it could be a progressive new normal. But let me speak directly to the question, Rola, you've asked, to say just the way you introduced it, a new kind of migration is the from Africa to the Middle East and to the GCC state is essentially what we need to understand, that what we see is a promotion of the race to the bottom. That whilst others are beginning to demand for more rights for their nationals that are working outside their shores, you see the host community showing a bit of nonchalance to say, if you can't take the condition that we have, then we go elsewhere, where others take it or leave it arrangement is easily available. And the challenge with this kind of labor migration mix that you see is that for Africa, when we began to have this relationship, there was so much a bit of excitement by African government to say, we are now creating jobs for our people. And so they can go and not minding, as it were, the conditions to which these persons go. Let me speak quickly to what the issues are, what are migrant fees. I have a presentation which I will share with you, can share with others later. But just to speak to the issue directly, what are the things we face, African migrant face? You continue to see a situation where this movement is leading to huge exploitation. A lot of persons are excited about the employment opportunities to go work outside the continent. And so the arrangement leads to the situation where you cannot go on your own. You need to go through somebody, and then for most persons, you need to go through recruitment agencies. We are beginning to experience bad, terrible fair recruitment practices on our continent. People moving. In other words, the crisis with the visa-tied employment relationship starts directly from home. Before these persons leave, they begin to experience exploitation from home itself, and then you find out that though in some cases it's beginning to improve, in some cases, I mean few cases. I will use example of Kenya, example of Uganda. After repeated knocks, you are beginning to see small increase improvements in regulating recruitment practices at home, and then the crisis of not preparing these migrants for what they are going to expect when they leave, when they get to their new societies. That is beginning to improve. But you see that the abuse we see, of course, outside the exploitation, and the exploitation I'm talking about, where these migrants are forced to pay, they are charged. Thank God the ILO has made a very definitive definition, brought about a definitive prescription to what recruitment fees and charges and costs should be, as against what these persons are bearing now, to say this is what the prescription should be. We are happy about that, and we on our continent we are running with that. But to say more, that when these people get there, you see the future that have come to define, or one of the futures, or one of the issues that have come to define the 2020 American election. Racism. You begin to see racism huge that our people suffer. Discrimination that is huge that they suffer. I've never come to understand how pigmentation of one's skin could be a crisis, but that you see very clearly in the employment tied relationship. And then of course that these persons that are forced to, or beyond recruiting from societies that cultures and religions are compatible. For those that are coming from such from the cultures and religion that are outside what is dominant in the Middle East, particularly in the GCC, you see that some of them are then forced to also subscribe to some sense of the dominant religious practices at home where they are working. And we have been able to also see the problem of multiple employers. One person is engaged, is tied to one family, but you see the family using that one woman or for aunties, go to this person's house, go and clean the house, particularly for a domestic worker. Go to this person's house, go and do multiple work, one pay, no different arrangement. And then of course, one of the things that gets us now worried with tied relationship is that you have abusive employer, in terms of those ones that abuse employees in sexual abuse. These persons cannot run away. Physical abuse, these persons cannot go away. And so on the basis of that, we have recorded deaths. That was in 2017, there was a case of a Uganda whose throat was slashed by his employer, killed. These are the forms of the kinds of abuses, and there are more. And then the question of the wage, the negotiation, the ability to negotiate. I'm happy the special rapporteur talks about the freedom of association. That is one thing as trade unions that is key to our heart. The absence of the right to belong to union, to be given that space to belong to union and to practice freely. That and to practice the enjoyment of that right, because freedom of association helps a worker to promote the enjoyment of other rights. And if you cannot freely associate, other rights are likely to suffer. And so the question is, what have we done beyond lamentation? What have we done as African trade unions? We have done quite a while for ourselves. First, the question is, how do we, I would say one of my excitements of joining this webinar is because I know that we are going to be discussing with quite a number, essentially with unions from Asia that have done very well, that have moved far with helping to see how they can protect the rights of migrants. And so how do we learn more from ourselves? So it's one of the interests why we're joining this webinar. We have, as African trade unions, we have our network on the continent that cuts across the continent, where we have focal persons dealing with migration work with their national government. Because the government, our argument is that this regime practice, because kafala is not going away on our continent as at the moment, but the good thing is that we are using this network to challenge the dominance of kafala on the continent. We have relationship with regional trade unions across Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Asian Pacific as a whole, Latin America, and then we are bringing the Europeans in to say even 5 other regional trade union organizations. We are coming together to work on how we can improve the right of migrants, especially with respect to all these issues, with visa tied as one. And on the question of visa tied situation, we have not been able to get out of that using the MOU that we have developed with these organizations. But we are beginning to put that issue on the Abu Dhabi dialogue process, visa tied regimes. We are putting it on the agenda for more discussion to say, how do we improve this kind of arrangement going forward. Rotna talked about the Bahrain flexible model, which was well canvassed by the Minister of Labor for Bahrain during the GCM negotiation in New York. That in itself, it's something we can live with, but in itself, it's fraught with a lot of difficulties. There are a lot of challenges with it. So we want to put this issue very strongly on the Abu Dhabi dialogue process to be able to then use it to see how we can improve it going forward. But more importantly, and then I will stop, I think my time is up. More importantly, to say we need to build this kind of our own non-state alliances well and stronger to be able to continue to engage more effectively with state partners. Comrades, I thank you for your audience. I'll stop briefly. If questions come, that might be an opportunity for me to take more bites. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Joel, and a lot to pick up on from what you've mentioned, and I think maybe a very essential point is that a lot of it also, when we talk about protection and ensuring the well-being of migrant workers, it also starts at home in terms of a lot of people that don't know what they are going into. They don't know that they're going to places where they cannot quit, to places where they cannot change employers and all of that. So how do we start from there? Another thing I pick up on strongly from what you said is that we really need to put this on the agenda of regional processes, to have this a more ambitious dialogue, as opposed to, the kind of what you've described very well in terms of what you talk about in terms of the race to the bottom that we currently have between governments. So how can governments come together, trade unions, but also civil society? Thank you, Joel. Very, very important points to take away as we progress in our discussion. Now I want to go to Elizabeth Tang, and I realized that Rotna gave the example previously of the UK domestic workers visa, something that has come under very heavy criticism. And I think a general observation is, even in situations where we have more progressive, let's say, employment regimes for other categories of workers, for domestic workers in particular, often the situation is much, much worse. And it's coming on top of different layers of exploitation. It's coming on top of working arrangements inside the home, shielded, concealed, where work conditions are very difficult to kind of control. I will let you, Elizabeth, speak to that. What is it about domestic work that makes it so complicated? What is it about this that we're not really able to resolve? Even when we speak of good practice elsewhere in other kinds of employment arrangements, I struggle to find good practice when it comes to domestic workers. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, you are right. It is a huge struggle. It's a huge challenge when the UK government reintroduced the employer tie visa system in the UK in 2012, the domestic workers organizations in the UK, the Voice of Domestic Workers, which is now our affiliates, was fighting, very, very hard. We also mobilized internationally to send letters, petition letters, because we really could not afford to see, more and more we're going to the opposite direction, instead of seeing situation improve. But actually, more and more governments are, resorting to employer tie visa system, and that subject more and more migrant domestic workers into extremely exploitative situations. We have heard a lot from the previous speakers about the situation in the MENA region, in the Gulf region, under the kafala system. But actually, almost all the country of destination for migrant domestic workers in Asia, all have employer-tied system for the migrant domestic workers. So from time to time, you also get to hear stories of migrant domestic workers, badly abused by their employers, even in Hong Kong, in Malaysia, in Singapore, exactly because they are also subject under this employer tie system, so that the employers are overpowered. They are like the winners who takes it all. They have all the power. They control not only the domestic workers' wages, labor rights conditions, but then they actually are controlling their legal status in the country and their ability to stay. So if they lose the job, for some reason, they lose the job, that means they also lose the ability to stay. And that that could means they have to immediately be repatriated back to their countries, and for majority of the migrant domestic workers, this is something they cannot afford to face, because they may have already paid a lot in order to come to work, and then maybe they are they still have debts to pay back. This is just something they cannot afford to face. And but if we look at this country of destination for the migrant domestic workers, we easily found that this type of visa, employer type visa, are only for the migrant domestic workers or other so-called low-skill workers, construction workers, or factory workers. Whereas for other kind of professions of workers of other sectors, they don't have this kind of visas. They can come, of course, when they come and they apply. There's an employer who does it. But once they get the visa, they come, they work, and then if they don't like the employer, they don't like the job, then they can look around and find other employers, and if they succeed, then they can leave. And their visa also not tied to the employment contract. Even the employment contract finished, and they can still stay as long as their visas is still valid. So this is extremely discriminatory arrangement for domestic workers and for other workers who are considered to be low skill. But then this gives rise to so much exploitation, abuses, and I don't have to repeat it. I mean, we have heard a lot stories from our previous speakers. But what is really detrimental is that in this situation, we actually make domestic workers even more invisible and voiceless, and that have a profound impact on how their situation can be changed. And of course, we believe that there can be better way to handle this employment relationship. If we look outside Asia, look outside the MENA region, I know that in some African countries, for example, in South Africa, which is also a big country of destinations, where migrant domestic workers from the neighboring countries, can cross the border, go there, they get temporary work visa, and then they are free to look for jobs and free to look for employers. And if there are problems, they quit and they can look for another employers to continue their contract and get the work visas. And in the whole Latin American regions, majority of the countries, where domestic workers can move freely, and in most of the countries like Argentina and Chile, the migrant domestic workers are entitled to the same labor rights protection, the same social protection as local domestic workers. So, so this is possible, to give decent work, to give the same kind of work arrangement to migrant domestic workers and to the local domestic workers. That is possible. And Yeah, again, I'd like to remind, what our first speaker, the UN Special Rapporteur, has reminded us about the importance of trade unions. And for the IDWF, we believe the way out is really to have to enable domestic workers to speak out, to advocate, to fight. So we are mandated to organize all the domestic workers. And the good news is in the last 5 years, we have made several breakthrough in terms of organizing in the country of destinations. Today we have affiliates in Malaysia, we have affiliates in Jordan, in Kuwait, and we also have built migrant domestic workers groups in Qatar. All these didn't exist 5 years ago, and they are now coming up. Of course, there is still a long way to go, before they can change the system, change the present working conditions. But we see hope, because domestic workers are getting organized, and they are saying, enough is enough. We are not here, to be like slave. We are workers, and we should have the rights as workers. And also we have found out, there are people in the local communities, who are also support our advocacy, who also do not believe in employer-type system. They also are supporting us and then working with us, and I believe that the next step is how to connect all the people of sharing the same vision, sharing the same goals, to work together, to get the synergy and to move this mountain. And I believe if we can link all, our domestic workers' power with the power of our allies in the country of destination, country of origin, we will be strong enough to move the mountain. And finally, I just want to say that it is time really for the international community, for the UN, for the different processes to critically review this employer-type system, because it is growing, and we are talking about millions of migrant domestic workers being abused because of this system, and this is really time to challenge it and to change this. So this is all I want to say, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and also to also kind of shed a light of hope on some of the things that have progressed on the ground, because sometimes when we focus on the problems, we tend to forget maybe how far we've come along. Also, very crucially, I think what you've said exposes the whole bluff of who is it affecting. It's really affecting low-skilled migrant workers, even where arrangements of employer-type visas exist. High-skilled migrant workers, we know, are able to find ways around this. They're able to move. They're able to find ways around the system. But who is stuck at the end of the day? It's people who are in the low-skilled sector. It's domestic workers. And maybe if for domestic workers, even so, with the whole, notions and cultural issues of how can she go out of the house, that gets even more and more complicated with linking the status of the domestic worker to the individual employer. So thank you for that. I'm sure we'll come back to you for more on this. And I think what you've said is actually the perfect segue in looking for other examples from around the world. Some good practices from Latin America. But before we get to the good practices, Elena, let me ask you a little bit about the not so good practices on the other side of the continent, on the US side. We've heard that there are still some employer-tied visa systems in the US that are very much alive, and they are operating maybe under different circumstances. But can you give us an idea about what are some of the issues within that particular context, but also how has civil society moved on this issue? Is there anything for us to learn from how you guys have been also operating on this? And then going back to the example of Latin America, why is it so different in Latin America? How can we get there? To you, Elena.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rula. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to MFA for the invitation to be here today. Congratulations, you have an incredible audience. So I'm really glad to be able to speak to a different audience, and I appreciate learning from the situation in other parts of the world. I also would like to acknowledge from the beginning that what I'm going to build on many of the comments from my predecessors on this panel, because I think that all of them made important contributions to where I'm hoping to get here today. So I think that there are a number of issues that have been said before that I will build on them towards my conclusion. I would like to describe briefly the system in the US, then jump into Mexico, and then move south to Argentina, and finalize with the discussion of the current migration law in Chile, because I think that it illustrates the difference in the panel. So the US immigration system very much has these categories of migrant workers with very different rules and regulations. It's in essence a discriminatory system. The more education, the more wealth you have, the different treatment you receive. Less education, less wealth, the unskilled worker, then the less rights and power you have in that relationship. And that's the first thing that I want to present today. Perhaps we need to revisit this idea of the skilled and the unskilled worker. It's a concept that economics has brought to us and that we have accepted and we use. But there are specific skills in agriculture. There are specific skills in all kinds of labor. So perhaps that's one first element that I think that we need to move ahead. But in the US, they have come up with these different categories. I want to underscore this exception, which are persons of what they call extraordinary abilities. So these are people in the science, in the arts, in education, business, athletics. Perhaps if any of you likes basketball and you're watching the NBA, those foreign players fall into this category. Persons of extraordinary abilities do not even need an employment offer. They can acquire an employment visa simply based on their abilities. And I think that's important to underscore. And then we fall onto these categories of professionals holding advanced degrees. And this, of course, many of these jobs are jobs that end up in the academia. Then we have skilled workers also with professional skills. And then we move on to certain special immigrants. And this is an interesting category because this is kind of a bag where they put together ministers from different religions. They have included, and this is interesting, a small number of Iraqi and Afghan translators, for instance, who were working for the US forces and they cannot continue living in their countries due to safety reasons, so they don't apply for asylum, but there is a small quota for them to come to the US, correct? There's also workers from the Panama Canal to reward them when the Panama Canal was under US administration, so they can migrate to the US based on this category. And I find that very interesting, as well as NATO civilians, okay? So this is a very peculiar category. Under these categories, the employer must demonstrate that the person is needed in the US, and then the person can travel for that worker visa. But definitely it's a different category. It's also very important to underscore that from this category, these are what in the US are called immigrant categories, meaning that you can enter the country under this visa and then apply for a permanent visa. That means living long-term in the United States. And this is a very complicated division that many countries have, and no one has underscored as much as I would like to. And it's this idea that there are this category of workers which are very much disposable. They are needed by the economy, but when they are not needed, they have to turn back. We are asking hundreds of thousands, millions of workers to be willing to work abroad with no expectation of on their own life projects. It's only a way for them to acquire a wage, but they cannot think long-term of moving with their families, of living long-term in that other country. So we are asking these millions of people to live life with a temporary kind of vision of their lives, when the rest of us may have the luxury of projecting ourselves and thinking that perhaps where we are is where we would like to stay a longer period of time. And I think that that's also something very important to underscore. Then in the US, we move into these other categories, which are like, then there is the H-1 visa, which is temporary employment. And this is a very interesting category because this is a category for individuals with a university higher degree. And these are the type of workers that we see in the tech industry in Silicon Valley in the United States, science, engineering, information technology workers, correct? Teaching, accounting. And this is interesting because this type of visa has a quota, and there are intermediaries who are immediately applying for those number of visas and then reselling them, correct? So we have intermediaries, not only in the unskilled visa categories, but also in the highly skilled categories. Then we go on to H2A, which are agricultural workers visas, and then we have H2B, which are non-agricultural workers visas. These are essentially temporary workers visas. In both cases, the maximum amount of time that they can remain in the country is for 3 years. They are tied to one employer only. And if they dare to complain about their working conditions, definitely they will fail, they will suffer the repercussions of that. At any point, the employer may decide to terminate that contract and that person returns to the country. In theory, they should not be charged for any fees. But what we know in practice is that the recruitment agencies in the countries of origin are charging them fees to be able to apply for those jobs. They have to go through a visa interview process, and then they are also charged to be accompanied to the US consulate to apply for the visa, for instance. They are charged all the way through the process. They work, they should not dare complain, and then they are returned back to the country of origin. What is interesting in the context of COVID-19 was that there was a specific shortage of agricultural workers, and so the US was faced with the need to extend the visa of those agricultural workers that were already in the US because they did not want agricultural workers to be coming at that time for the fear of bringing more cases of COVID into the United States. So I think it's an interesting system in which workers are basically unprotected, and we see great differences. Now, when we move then down South America, what we observe in most countries is the idea, again, that you are only employed if you have a working relationship. You need a contract to apply for a worker's visa originally. And that's the requirement, for instance, in countries like Mexico to enter the country. If you do not have that contract, you are unable to acquire the visa. And that, of course, it's a great problem. Only if you have a family relationship with a Mexican national, you can apply for a worker visa once you are inside the country. And that, of course, creates great problem because we have to acknowledge that a pragmatical approach works much better. That individuals sometimes travel without a job relationship already established, but they hope to get one. And in many cases, they find jobs. So some countries have rather changed to a more pragmatic approach, allowing individuals to enter the country with any visa, kind of like a tourist visa, and then inside the country, applying for a worker's visa. And of course, if you are negotiating inside the country, a migrant worker is very much at the same situation as a national worker, probably not the same because the employer understands that they need the visa. So that's an element in the relationship, but they are better off than when you are hired abroad. That is probably when workers are at the weakest in terms of the power relationship. And that is what other countries have done. That is the model that Chile used to have some years ago. And that is the current model that Argentina has, a very pragmatic model. You come into the country, You found a job, then you apply for a temporary worker's visa. And they use the definition of a migrant worker of the Migrant Workers Convention, which I also think it's remarkable about the Argentinian legislation. I think it's quite progressive. To finalize, what is going now in Chile is that they are having a discussion to review their immigration legislation. And they claim that immigration can only be safe, orderly, and regular, as the compact calls it, if you apply for a worker's visa from abroad. Okay, they want to move into the model of the consular visas, which is very much the model that I described in the context of the US. What we know in practice is that that is not the reflection of migration, that many individuals enter the country and then they find a job. So if the desire is really to have safe, regular, and orderly migration, a pragmatic approach is definitely the most important one. Finally, I want to underscore a couple of concerns, and it's whether in some countries, workers are able to change employer. What Elizabeth just mentioned, the ability for the worker to work with one person and then perhaps they find someone else where they are treated better, or their wages better, the working conditions improve, and they want to move to that other job. In many visas in the United States, you are tied to that employer. And I think that that's something that we really need to fight to eliminate everywhere in the world, to give greater freedom and protection to employers. The second, and probably the most important vulnerability that we observe in the US, is the consequences that workers face when they file a lawsuit, when they complain against their employer. In many countries, what we are observing is that employers are denouncing their workers immediately to the immigration authorities, and workers are being apprehended for deportation when they are in court, filing lawsuits, in the middle of labor cases against their employers. And I think that that's an atrocity that should not be taking place, and which should ensure some basic protections for workers. So when a worker files a lawsuit against their employer, they should immediately be granted some kind of immunity for immigration enforcement until that case finalizes. Otherwise, even if in the remote possibility that the worker wins, that worker will also struggle even to obtain back the wages that they were not paid to them or any other amount. So I think that that's a second element that I want to bring. The recruitment fees are a big challenge. I think that not enough is being done. I know of the ILO efforts to try to work on this issue, but I do think that there has to be greater coordination between the countries of origin of the employers and the countries of destination. Many of the fees are being actually charged at the country of origin. There isn't enough supervision, and more could be done in that regard. Finally, I want to bring to the table the portability of benefits, because we also have to understand that many of these workers are being deducted part of their wages, and they're contributing to the social security system of countries where they are not going to retire, and they are unable to take those savings, their own contributions, back to the country of origin. And I think that that's a final element in which we all need to continue working. There are some efforts in South America, which I think are very promising as a result of agreements, and we should be able to move ahead. I think this is a very interesting and energizing discussion, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for this great overview of what works and what doesn't work. And I think as you call early on, we need to relook at this distinction, or as Elizabeth also puts it, discrimination between the skilled and non-skilled worker. One thing that caught my attention really was how you talk about this visa conversion. So you can enter on a tourist visa and then convert your visa into a work permit that exists and works in some parts of the world. I know, at least in this part of the world, sometimes this is also again taken on to say, how do we ensure that countries of origin also know that their nationals are abroad and that they get access to consular protection, which also kind of raises another set of questions. But it's interesting to know that it is working, and it can work in one part of the world. And I think just gathering from our discussion, we've had some interesting ideas about, what's next. Obviously, we all know there is a problem here, but what's next? And then, Elena, you say critically and crucially the need to be able to change employers. We've also heard ideas about people coming in on an employment category as opposed to people coming in attached to a particular employer. So I think we've kind of covered a lot since we started. Just moving on with the conversation, I think it would be interesting also to see what some of the people on the webinar are thinking, and where are some of the ideas that they can contribute. And I hope in this next section maybe we can try to narrow down on discussing some of these alternatives, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can move a little bit further in the conversation. What kind of alternative processes have we seen, and how have they turned out to be in their particular context? May I call on Ellen Sana? I've noted that Ellen Sana from the Philippines is with us today. Ellen, can you hear us?
Hi.
Hi, Ellen.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Maybe just to comment. Sorry? Are you asking me to? What happened?
Yes,
Yeah.
Ellen, to comment on the conversation so far.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think that one, the employer tied visa is not only in the Middle East, as we also heard from the other speakers from the other regions, and right within the Southeast Asian countries, there is also similar arrangements where migrants are allowed to enter or stay in the country of destination on the basis of a valid contract. So if there is no contract, then the perception of the host country is that they have no right to stay there. So, and that's why, as the special rapporteur also mentioned, yeah, because the idea is something temporary, and that it's up to the host country to determine when they can enter and when they should leave the country, which I think is quite not balanced, because as we are saying, there is the pull and the push factor for migration. And I think up to this time, the burden, the weight is so much in consideration of what the country of destination desires. But I think it's about time, and especially after the adoption of the Global Compact, that we try to make a more balanced presentation of labor migration, that it cannot only be just in consideration mostly of the country of destination, but that it should be something where migrants may be treated more fairly, and especially women migrant workers. So that's one point. The second point is particularly the kafala system, as Rotna mentioned, and I think in many conversations we had also with people from the Middle East, they would say that the kafala system was something good. And we would agree if the context is you are inviting somebody to come over and they would be happy to have you in their countries. But of course, in the context of labor migration, it's not the case. You are not inviting somebody who is a dear friend, who is a relative, but you are having somebody who is a stranger to work for you or to work with you in the household. And so I think part of the advocacy, if not to totally abolish the kafala system, is you have to adjust it. That in the context of the Middle East now, what you're having are migrant workers. They are workers. They are not your relatives. So you have to adjust. So if you want to, they should be treated as workers and not be treated like slaves, as what is happening now. Practically, like we have a lot of stories of women migrant workers in particular, where they experience sexual assault, no less committed by their employers, and yet it's the same employer who would make the decision whether they should leave or not leave the country of destination. So I think then that practically curtails the access to justice of the person, of the aggrieved migrant worker. So I think now that we have a multilateral framework on migration, which is rights-based at the same time, while it's non-binding, I think we should try to rethink a lot of these issues. Even the whole idea of the temporariness of migrant labor should be subject to a lot of rethinking. And of course, also the kafala system, how you will adjust to the two situations. Thank you. I hope it helps.
Thank you, Ellen. Sarah Al-Khatib, are you with us? Maybe Sarah, you can tell us a little bit about some proposals in Jordan to have more flexible arrangements. What's the take on this? What's happening in Jordan in terms of flexibility and employer-tied visas?
Yeah, so in Jordan, it's also like in Gulf and Lebanon, the workers work under the sponsorship system, exploitative conditions, and the workers are usually tied to one employer who they cannot change without going through a very complicated process, and the employer is responsible for issuing and renewing the work and residency permits. And the worker is not only tied to this employer and this exploitative employment relationship, but also they have another relationship with the government and the security authorities who also punish the workers for violating the residency law through the overstay fines, punishment, deportation, and detention. And during COVID, the workers are still suffering from the sponsorship system because they are unable to leave the country or apply for repatriation without getting the approval from the employer, who has to officially end the employment relationship by canceling the work permit. And of course, if the worker is undocumented, the employer will use this or the worker's residency status to exploit the worker more by not allowing them to leave the country. So in Jordan, like migrant workers are subject to the labor law, whether in the garment sector or the domestic work sector, but not yet in the agriculture sector. So like the labor law doesn't use the term sponsor or kafil, but actually the practice is a sponsorship system. And the government last year like came up with a new work permit type, which is the flexible work permit. But we have concerns, like unions and civil society organizations that work on labor issues have concerns of this type of work permit, because it's actually puts burden on the workers, because they will not be in an employment relationship. They will be more like self-employed, and they will be responsible for their social security, medical insurance. So they will lose benefits that workers subject to the labor law usually have when they are in an employment relationship with a specific employer. And recently in the agriculture sector, a group of civil society organizations and unions in Jordan worked on a draft for the agriculture workers regulation. And we also submitted like a proposal on ending the sponsorship practices in the agriculture sector by giving more flexibility to workers to change employers and change even the sector they work in without losing their labor rights or benefits. So it's maybe there's no time now to talk more about the details, but it's about like giving the workers the ability to move between sectors and employers, and still have the employer responsible for the workers' labor rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, and very much connecting with what Ratna talked about in terms of flexible arrangements and the whole question of the workers' social protections. Colleagues are also noting that we have a few people also on the line. We have Professor Binod Kadria, Paddy Sinyanga, Dr. Raj Bardui, and also Laxman Basnet. Professor Kadria, can we go to you for a quick comment on the topic? You're on mute.
No. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts on this. It's a very, very rich discussion that's going on. In fact, anything to discuss with visas has been a hot potato. We don't hear about it in multilateral negotiations. This is wrapped under the, privacy of sovereignty and so on. So I think it is important to demystify the visa issues, and I think Elena has actually talked about the US system, and similarly we need to learn about other systems also in other countries, including my own country, India, because we don't know what is the small print is there. Having said that, since the time is limited, I would just share 2 comments. One is that we need to understand that it is more pervasive than to think that it is only for low-skilled migrants, workers, that these kind of visa restrictions or employer-tied visas and other kinds of visa restrictions apply. They are actually applying across the board in different forms and different, like H-1B is tied, and similarly, in all countries, you'll find even in India, they are tied. What should we ask for? What should be the demand for? The demand, should we demand that it should be completely free from employer tying up, or should we say, well, there should be minimum time period? Should it be 6 months or 3 months or 1 year or something? What are the conditions that are acceptable to the interest of the labor? That is point number 1. So that I think is being more practical. The second point is more in terms of addressing the categories. What category are we addressing? We start with human rights. Now, are we actually in the domain of human rights, or we are in the domain of labor rights? The 2 are completely different things. And I see that both the things are being addressed, but they are, there are overlapping areas. But what we are addressing at this particular session is labor rights. We are not talking about human rights. Human rights would apply to the families, to the children, to the other people. But labor rights, the employer-tied visa is a labor rights issue. And that is not for asking for charity, not asking for mercy. It is a demand, legitimate demand, according to the labor law. If it does not exist in the labor law, then that labor law must be changed. Like there has to be parity between domestic labor and for migrant labor. If there is a difference between the 2, like we have heard some examples, then that has to be demanded. So I think we should not dilute our own demand that we are going for human rights. For example, we should have human rights, we should have labor rights, and then we should talk about heinous crime against humanity, like rape and other things and sexual exploitation. All those are heinous crimes. They belong to a completely different genre of exploitation. I think we should not mix up the issues because that dilutes our entire canvas. We should rather dissect them, put them into smaller boxes, because smaller boxes are easier to address. And that is, I think, something that I carry from this particular session's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kadri. And maybe we can take your cue and asking the first question is, what is it exactly what we are asking for, which is a very good question. Paddy, are you with us? Are you able to come in for a quick comment?
7.
What?
When I left, yeah, 8 years ago, it was 7 to the dollar because when they converted, my salary was high and then it crashed. I think when I was leaving, it was like 12 or 13.
Paddy, hello? Hello?
She has some noise in the background. So
hello.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay,
yes.
Sorry, I had a bit of noise in my background with some construction next door, so it wasn't clear. I think I just to say thank you to all the experts for a very insightful discussion. I've really been sitting down here and taking down notes. What really stood out for me, I think, in all these discussions is sort of looking at the next step and what can be done. Obviously, taking advantage of that the world is in a reset mode, and that we have the opportunities. I think the call that was made by Akator about the better alliances, I think that really makes a lot of sense for me, and I think this is something that everybody has resounded in different ways, in the sense that countries really have to move in together, especially where you have groups of migrants that are coming from different countries, but you have one common destination. I tend to think about some of the African governments that are seeing, for instance, the GCC countries as new markets for labor, and not really, this looks like the route out because of the economic situation, because of youth unemployment on the African continent. So obviously, you would think that the natural way is to build a private sector, within these different countries, but they have different types of problems. So when you see an employment sector outside, it seems as an avenue, and they're thinking that labor agreements is just the way to go. But there's a lot more to go into these labor agreements and what it means for these young men and women who have to take up work in another place, what it sort of means in terms of the different considerations that have to be made on them leaving families behind. That's another big thing, that you have a lot of children left behind, and this is also not really taken into consideration, especially with a lot of young and also parents left behind, because when you look at the African continent and in also other parts of the world, it's family systems are very dependent on the one who is the breadwinner in the household. So when the breadwinners leave, children are left with neighbors, they're left with grandparents, and sometimes left out in boarding schools, because this becomes the new norm. But all those things that are happening. So I think there's a lot that sending countries have to do as a homework on the ground. And then I think there's a lot that has to be done with recruitment agencies, and that's really understanding them, and recruitment agencies understanding the migrant worker themselves, their needs, religious concerns. I think this is also has been raised, what kind of freedoms go into it, and to orient these young men and women as they set out, to move into a new territory of work. Some who have probably never even entered their capital cities in their own countries, and are being taken across on the other side. So I think a lot of considerations, and also understanding what it means in terms of, not government just looking at remittances. I think this has also been a way to sort of look at support back into the economy, but how this works into the local economies where these migrant workers are coming from. So I think a lot of issues to deal with, and some very good insights. So thank you for having me give a few reflections there. Thank you, Rula.
Thank you, Paddy. Thanks so much. Dr. Raj Bardoui, are you with us for a quick reflection? Maybe not. Can we go to Lakshman Basnet from Sartuk? Lakshman, are you with us?
Better. She's not there.
Lakshman, are you here?
Yeah. Thank you, Rola, for giving me this opportunity. I am just thinking, listening to all this, no matter what kind of visa it is, the migrant it's about time that we have to think whether the migrant workers are getting benefit out of it. Who is getting benefit out of it? The first is, until and unless the countries, the sending country, country of origin, do not take interest in their own people, you and I, the trade union and the civil society group or the intellectual group, cannot do anything. So the countries have to take, I'm not talking about the category, which category is better than the other one. I'm listening to your discussion from the very beginning, and I don't see any category gives relief to the migrant worker, a respectful life, or under freedom. It's a process of 300, 500 years old process. Again, the slavery in a different, very nice word. So what we have to do is certain human rights, freedom of association has to be there. Some where I can express my deep feeling that what kind of treatment I'm getting in the country of destination. We go there, the migrant workers go there under the agreement between the two countries. No matter who gives me visa, but it's the country gives us the visa. So the regional negotiations has to come together. We will be lost in the global negotiation. Our voices would not be heard in the global negotiation. There are very big talks. I have attended GCM, almost all of them, but the regional negotiation is the most important, and the country of origin has to come together with the civil society and the trade union. What do they want? Do they want to sell their people to the oblivion, or do they want their people to have a respectful life in the country of destination? This is all I have to say. I have seen or heard all the discussions, and one may be a little better than the other one. One kind of category of visa may be a little better than the other. But are we looking for a little better one than the other one? No, we want the freedom to work there in a very same as the GCM says, same as the national worker. If I want to go to the GCC country, I should have the same right as the national worker. This is all I have to say. Thank you very much, Rola.
Thank you, Lakshman, for that. A good conclusion to this segment of the webinar. I think now we will get back to our panelists to offer some concluding remarks. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time for question and answers, but just I think it would be nice to focus on what is our takeaway from this discussion. And as Professor Kadri has put it, what is it exactly that needs to happen for us to kind of break the cycle and then move towards better systems that protects migrant rights in that particular context. So now zooming down on this, I'll start by order of the speakers. I'll start with you, Ratna, and then go to the rest of the panel.
Thank you. And just to say thanks again to all of the people who joined us today and to the panel speakers as well. I also found it very illuminating. I think for me, what I've taken away is, to really look at what else exists out there, to really look at what is our vision going to be to see how to replace this issue. And while there's a lot of discussion about what sending countries should do, freedom of association, a lot of issues about justice, there's a whole host of things that have to happen as well in order to ensure that migrant workers are able to realize their rights. But essentially, the kafala system is still the bedrock of a lot of the abuse and exploitation that we're seeing. And if we want to move away from it, what is it that we're asking for? Now, for us as a human rights organization, we're not supposed to be presenting a whole new visa regime. And there isn't really international guidance that tells you what does a visa regime supposed to look like. It only tells you what it shouldn't be doing. And those principles are to make sure that migrants do not have their rights abused. And it's become very clear that the kafala system abuses human rights of migrants, and that the tied visa system is in a sense the primary source of that abuse and exploitation. And so it must be reformed. Now, whether we're talking about moving away from an employer-ties system where you can still change employers, but you still need an employer to come into the country, potentially still better, but or whether we move entirely away from that to where we have an entirely different visa where it's just with the government. Does that exist for a specific category of workers? Which categories of workers? Is it going to be dependent on the labor market or more? Of course, it's a very difficult one. And because it's been, as some people have mentioned, an issue of immigration, security, and sovereignty, it's always been a very difficult one for us to construct an argument on. But I think it's worthwhile for us to really consider the arguments, consider what will it look like if you do have a different regime? Will this be a good thing, and or will it present a different set of problems? And how can we counteract those other problems as well? And those things such as the portability of benefits that we've talked about, those things will then become important. So whether we do it now, we do it later, that's something that we do need to keep in mind as we start discussing the alternatives. But I do want to end on a note of optimism, which is that, I feel we're in a place where we can at least discuss what the alternative is. 10 years ago, we were trying to talk about the kafala system, and talking about what it is was really hard. And now we're in a situation where the kafala is a dirty word. They don't want to use the word anymore. We're in a position where we can talk about what alternative exists and we can position that. So I'd like us to start thinking through that for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Ratna. Joel, to you for concluding thoughts.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to come back again to the point we made earlier to say we cannot do this alone. We really need to come together and build our forces in terms of how we can better engage state actors. First, this is not, when we advocate for the human and labor rights of migrants in this context, it is not a contest between us and government. In other words, we must always make these persons understand that we are not competing with anybody. We are only interested in making and improving the situation for everyone. I would say that our work on fair recruitment will be also much more important because this is also how this whole thing work. We must continue to do work around that. And on the issue of advocacy, which was the point the comrade that gave the example analysis around Latin America, Mexico, some country, and the US in terms of how these things work. To be able to continue to speak to say, when we talk about labor rights and work, humans, workers, and their rights is not one that should be commodified. It's not a commodity. And the whole essence of what this right means, how should this work, should continue to speak. And then also I will advocate that we should specify our terrains. How do I mean? The issues are broad. This visa-tied employment regime is a wide thing. Where should we be playing? And then there should be focus. We've seen ourselves really focused on Africa, Middle East. And then we want to be able to see all of that kind of similar actors within that space where we are working together, pushing that, not necessarily in silos, but in that kind of a coordinated approach to how we do things. And then finally, to say that for all of us, we will continue to also learn. There is room for capacity to improve our understanding of these issues. And so let's work together to make ourselves available to continue to learn and to our understanding of the context, and to be able to work together to devise better and sharper alternatives that can work. But most importantly, we need our togetherness to continue this struggle. I thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Joel. To you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, for me, what I want to add is, the need for more awareness of the situation, including labor rights situation, the arrangement of visas, information such as this in the country of destination for those who want to migrate and who are preparing to migrate. I see that there is some progress. At least nowadays, people in the country of origin will not think that those who are able to migrate, will surely win and surely get rich. They do understand it is hard, but very rarely they have a real understanding of the situation. And that is what a lot of pre-departure education awareness raising it is lacking. So I think prevention is always very important, and that is something we have to do more. And secondly, I still want to repeat the need on how to strengthen the alliances among domestic workers unions and the unions of other workers and other partners, in both and the destination country and the country of origins to work together to improve this situation. And I really believe this employer tie visa, should be thoroughly examined and criticized and look at how we can improve the system.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Elena, to you for the final word.
Well, thank you. I think that it's been a very interesting and engaging discussion. Even the comments on the chat box, I find very, very interesting. I would like to underscore a couple of points. I think that what Professor Kadria was saying about this interesting distinction between labor rights and human rights, it's very provocative. And it comes very provocative, at least to me, who have always looked at this issue from a human rights framework. But I do think he has a very good point in terms of how we can empower workers from that perspective. And, perhaps giving greater relevance and importance in our own advocacy work to labor rights. I think that that's crucial. And so I think that the question is, how can we empower workers? And a number of things have been said that I do want to underscore, and it's the information that workers have even before they leave their country about the conditions that they are going to encounter. And I think that the second element is the role of consulates, something that we have not mentioned, but I do think we need to push for is for consular protection of workers. That needs to be an important field of work for consulates. It's not only in the field of criminal law enforcement, but it's really in the field of labor law enforcement. They could be doing much more than what they are doing until this point. I do want to underscore that I think that the protection or immunity for immigration enforcement, while they are claiming violations of labor law, is crucial. And I think that should be in our agenda as well. Two other points that I want to underscore is the relevance of labor inspections. That is a field where we need to do more. Some countries in Latin America, for instance, have even moved to carrying out labor inspections in the case of domestic workers. And I think that that's an important step forward. We also need to make sure that these labor inspections are conducted from the perspective of labor violations and not looking into immigration enforcement, so that workers are not punished if they are in an irregular situation, but that they are protected and viewed as workers. And I think that that's really a way in which we can move forward. Finally, I think there is much more that can be done in terms of labor legal representation. Governmental agencies in the countries where workers are being employed should have greater resources and personnel so that they can really respond to the needs of workers. And of course, unions play an important role here, but we need to make sure that any worker, even those that are not part of a union, have some possibility of finding information and of finding legal representation. I think that that's empowering workers is the only way forward. And I hope that we can continue advancing. As Ratna was saying, we are not where we were 10 years ago, and let's hope that we are in a much better place in 10 years looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for those final thoughts, and also a huge thank you to the entire panel. I think it's been a very, very rich discussion, and there are so many takeaways. So I'm not even going to try to highlight the main points, but some things that resonate with me is that we've spoken about this being a process that starts at home and also continues in the country of destination. We spoke a lot about, the difference between being able to move from one employer to the other, as opposed to be able to come into a country where one is not linked to a particular employer. We've raised the issue of social protections, the portability of benefits. Crucially, we've also talked about access to justice. This is where a lot of this gets stuck, and this is where a lot of the exploitation is allowed to continue to happen. So I think we have a lot from what we've learned, and we also have a lot in terms of what has happened in the past few years, whereas it's not even possible to speak of one model or one kafala, if you can say, or one way of tying workers to the employers. We know that there are divergent practices. They know that there are different issues, and as time has progressed, we have also progressed in terms of advocacies and able to talk about the issue, but also even governments considering moving away from these models. My takeaway personally, I think we are in an exceptional times. Maybe these times where mobility has stopped, people have stopped being able to move across borders. Maybe really this is the time to push for mobility in countries of destination, to push for delinking workers from employers. Maybe this is the opportunity for us. I would really like to thank all our panelists today for their wonderful contributions to this discussion. It's been absolutely wonderful to be able to have this discussion with you. Before I hand over to Sada, who will give the very warm vote of thanks, I would just like to draw your attention that starting from next week, the three organizations again are going to have a 23-part webinar actually, and this is really looking at the 23 objectives of the GCM. It's an ambitious endeavor, but we already do have a lot of very committed, very resourceful resource persons that will go with us every week, 23 weeks from now. So prepare yourselves, brace yourselves for a very interesting discussion. It's 4 organizations actually. I forget, we have a new organization on board, which is the Civil Society Action Committee, who will be joining us in this endeavor. But stay with us. Next week's discussion will be on data, and it will be a very, very interesting discussion, if I can say so. Do join us next week. With that, I will like to thank everybody. I will hand it over to Sada to give the final word of thanks.
Thank you, Rola, for in fact, it is very diverse range of issues. Within the visa, kind of issue, we brought out several issues. And thank you all the panelists, all the participants. In fact, I'll just, Elizabeth Tang, Philippe, Gonzalez Morales, Joel Odigy, Helena Ulia, Ratna Begum, and all these speakers, they have brought out several issues, diverse range of issues which span from different countries, and enrich the discussion, and will be bringing out a policy brief from that. And thank all the participants, all the very eminent scholars in the audience. And I thank Rola for moderating so well. It was so smooth, and so many points were raised, and all the participants for raising so many important questions. And as Rola already mentioned, we will be having a series of panel discussion from the September 1st onwards for continuously for 6 months, and we look forward to your participation also. Thank you so much. And if you can show the poster now, is it okay, or can we have the poster now for next panel? Okay, so the thing is already Rola announced, this is about GCM Objective 1, collect and utilize accurate and disaggregate data as a basis for evidence-based policies. In fact, most of the policies without data become failure. So data is very important. So we look forward to your participation from next, 6 months onward. Means we will have several panel discussion, and we look forward to your participation. Thank you so much.